I always believed betrayal arrived loudly, with shouting and slammed doors. I was wrong. Mine came quietly, through a phone call that made my chest tighten before my mind could catch up. They told me my daughter-in-law was at the bank, standing beside a man who looked exactly like my son. The problem was simple and devastating. My son was supposed to be out of town. In that instant, trust cracked. Not all at once, but enough to let doubt seep in and poison everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the safety of letting others handle my life. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different places and experiences. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, sit back, take a breath, and get ready for a journey that might change the way you see trust, family, and yourself. Let's dive in. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that disappearing quietly was a form of maturity. Not the dramatic kind of disappearing that leaves empty rooms and unanswered letters, but the subtle kind that happens when your name remains on documents while your voice slowly fades from the room. I did not notice it happening at first. It felt polite, reasonable, almost loving. I live alone in Portland, Oregon, in the same house my husband and I bought decades ago when our son was still small and the walls seemed louder than they are now. My husband has been gone for nearly 10 years. His absence settled into the house gradually, like dust, until it became part of the furniture. I am not lonely in the way people imagine. I have routines. I wake early. I make coffee the same way every morning. I read. I walk. The days pass with a quiet order that can easily be mistaken for peace. Before retirement, I taught high school English for over 30 years. I spent my career asking teenagers to read carefully, to question what they were given, to notice what was missing as much as what was present. I taught them that language matters, that small shifts in wording often hide larger intentions. Somewhere along the way, I stopped applying those lessons to my own life. I assumed experience would protect me from being careless. It did not. My son, Daniel Collins, is my only child. He is grown, capable, and kind in the way men often are when life has not yet demanded too much from them. When he married Rebecca, I welcomed her easily. She was organized, confident, and efficient. She spoke quickly and acted faster. She noticed things I no longer bothered with, or so I told myself. When she offered to help manage paperwork, appointments, and accounts, it felt natural to accept. It felt like the proper rhythm of generations handing things over. At first, nothing truly changed. My name remained on every account. I still signed where I was asked to sign. But slowly, the documents arrived already prepared. The explanations became shorter. I was told what had been handled rather than asked what should be done. I began signing without reading closely, trusting that someone younger and sharper had already done the thinking for me. It felt efficient. It felt considerate. It felt safe. I told myself that this was what families did, that love meant letting go of control, that independence had an expiration date, and mine was approaching whether I liked it or not. When something confused me, I brushed it aside rather than asking for clarification. I did not want to be difficult. I did not want to become the woman people spoke around instead of to. Ironically, that fear guided me directly toward that outcome. There was no single moment when I lost my place. It happened through dozens of small decisions that did not feel like decisions at all. A document signed quickly, a question left unasked, a folder placed in someone else's drawer. My life remained orderly, but it was no longer entirely mine. I mistook the absence of conflict for stability. Looking back, I can see how neatly everything aligned to make me step aside without resistance. I had trusted the structure of family more than my own instincts. I believed that care and control could not occupy the same space. I was wrong, but I did not know it yet. That morning began like any other, with coffee cooling on the counter and the house wrapped in its familiar quiet. I had no sense that the calm I had accepted for so long was about to fracture. I did not yet understand that silence, once chosen too often, eventually stops being a choice at all. If you're still watching and feeling that quiet tension building, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. What comes next is the moment where something small feels off, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The morning began without any warning signs. The light in my kitchen was soft and ordinary, filtered through the same window that had watched over decades of breakfasts and quiet thoughts. I had just poured my second cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was not early, but it was early enough that I paused before answering. Banks rarely call individuals before mid-morning unless something requires attention, and I remember thinking that detail even before I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end introduced herself carefully and confirmed my full name. She spoke with a professionalism that felt slightly rehearsed, as though each word had been weighed before it left her mouth. I listened without interrupting, my mind already sorting tone from content, habit from my years in the classroom. There was no friendliness in her voice, only restraint. She told me that my daughter-in-law was at the bank. That alone did not alarm me. Rebecca handled many things. Then she added that my son was there as well. I felt a small shift inside my chest, not panic, but resistance. The way a sentence resists when one word does not belong. I did not correct her. I waited. There was a pause, brief but deliberate, and then the question arrived, carefully phrased and unmistakably intentional. Was he not away? The words did not rush at me. They settled slowly, one by one, until they formed something solid and wrong. I pictured Daniel's message from the night before, the short note about meetings in Vancouver and how tired he sounded. I had read it without suspicion then. Now it echoed differently. I did not accuse the woman of making a mistake. I did not insist she had the wrong information. Instead, I asked her to repeat what she had said. She did, exactly the same way, without apology. That was when I understood this was not a misunderstanding. If it were, she would have rushed to correct herself, to explain, to smooth the moment over. She did none of those things. She told me there were documents involved, authorizations, signatures, adjustments that required confirmation. She did not say the word problem, but it was present in every careful pause. She asked if I could come in as soon as possible. Not urgently, she clarified, but promptly. It was a distinction that mattered. Urgency invites panic. Promptness invites control. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, the phone still warm in my hand. The room felt unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted. The quiet I had grown accustomed to suddenly felt thin, like a surface that could crack if pressed. I realized that my heart was steady. That surprised me. I had expected fear, or confusion, or the instinct to call my son immediately. Instead, I felt alert. I thought of the way Rebecca had always moved quickly through tasks, how she preferred decisions to be efficient rather than discussed. I thought of how often I had accepted that pace without question. None of those memories were evidence, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Patterns had always mattered to me more than isolated facts. I did not call Daniel. I did not text Rebecca. If something was unfolding without my knowledge, I needed to see it clearly before I spoke. Words, once released, could not be taken back. I understood that now more than ever. I gathered my coat and my purse with deliberate movements, checking for my keys twice, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted nothing to distract me later. As I stepped outside, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The ordinary world continued, unaware that my sense of balance had been quietly disturbed. I locked the door behind me and stood for a moment on the front step, breathing in the familiar air. I did not yet know what I would find at the bank. I only knew that whatever was waiting for me there did not fit the life I thought I understood. And when something does not fit, it is rarely harmless. If you're still watching and that phone call made your stomach drop, comment number 2 below so I know you're following closely. The next chapter is where suspicion turns into something far more unsettling. Let's continue to chapter 3. I drove to the bank with an unusual calm, the kind that arrives not from confidence but from focus. The streets of Portland looked unchanged, wet pavement reflecting a pale sky, pedestrians moving with the same distracted purpose they always had. I noticed everything and felt strangely detached from it, as if I were observing my own life from a careful distance. Whatever waited for me inside that building, I understood that reacting too quickly would only blur what I needed to see. The bank lobby was cool and quiet, its order almost severe. The air smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution. Before I reached the counter, a security guard glanced at me twice, then nodded as if confirming something he already knew. A young employee approached and addressed me by name without asking. That detail settled heavily in my chest. I had not announced myself, yet I had been expected. I was guided down a narrow hallway into a small office with frosted glass walls. The door was left slightly open, not enough for privacy, but enough for observation. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muted sounds of the lobby beyond the glass. Numbers chimed softly, chairs shifted, everything sounded normal, which somehow made the moment sharper. Through the glass, I saw Rebecca first. She was seated at a desk, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly over her purse. She looked composed, as though this were a routine errand. There was no tension in her shoulders, no sign of urgency. That ease unsettled me more than panic would have. It suggested familiarity. Then I saw him. The man standing beside her had my son's face. Not a vague resemblance, not the kind people exaggerate out of politeness, but a precise duplication that made my breath catch. His height, the slope of his shoulders, even the way he leaned slightly forward as he listened were painfully familiar. For a brief second, my body reacted before my mind could intervene. My legs weakened, and I gripped the edge of the desk behind me to steady myself. What struck me most was not the face itself, but the confidence with which he occupied it. He nodded at the banker at the same moments Daniel would have. He touched his chin absently, a habit my son had since adolescence. These were not coincidences. They were studied details, rehearsed until they appeared natural. A bank representative spoke quietly beside me, explaining that a transaction was in progress involving account adjustments and authorizations. There had been minor inconsistencies, she said, enough to pause the process, but not enough to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Her words were careful, neutral, designed to inform without alarming. I barely heard her. My attention was fixed on the scene beyond the glass. I did not feel anger then. I felt clarity. No one assembles a performance like that without planning. No one imitates a life without access and time. Whatever this was, it had not begun that morning. The urge to step into the room rose sharply, to confront Rebecca, to demand explanations, to hear her voice break or harden. I felt it in my chest, pressing upward. Then I let it pass. If I revealed myself now, the story would change instantly. Denial would fill the space where truth had been quietly exposed. Instead, I stepped back. The bank staff did not question my decision. They seemed to understand that silence, at times, is its own form of control. I left through a side exit, the cool air outside hitting my face with a force that felt almost cleansing. Traffic moved steadily. A bus hissed to a stop nearby. Life continued without pause. I walked a short distance before stopping, my heart finally catching up with my mind. I had seen enough to know that nothing about this was accidental. Someone had built a copy of my son and placed it carefully where trust was assumed. And for the first time since the phone rang that morning, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not a mistake to be corrected quickly. It was a plan, and I would not dismantle it by rushing in blindly. If you're still watching, and that scene left you uneasy, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. What happens next isn't loud or dramatic, but it's where the truth starts taking shape. Let's move on to chapter 4. I returned home through streets that felt unfamiliar, not because they had changed, but because I had. The house greeted me with the same quiet it always had, yet that quiet no longer felt neutral. It felt observant. I set my purse down carefully, as if the room itself were listening, and stood in the center of the living room for a moment before moving. Familiar objects surrounded me, arranged just as I had left them, and still I felt as though I had stepped into a place that had been occupied in my absence. I began with the filing cabinet in the hallway, the one I had not opened in months. The folders were neatly aligned, their labels facing outward. At first glance, nothing appeared disturbed. Birth certificates, insurance policies, old tax records, everything in its expected place. That sense of order should have reassured me. Instead, it unsettled me. It was too precise, too untouched, like a display rather than a working archive. As I lifted each folder, I noticed the pattern. Originals were missing. In their place were clean, high-resolution copies, printed recently, the ink still sharp. My identification documents were there, but not there. The weight of them was wrong, lighter than it should have been. I checked the drawer twice, then a third time, hoping I had overlooked something. I had not. I moved to the bedroom and opened the small lockbox where I kept my medical records. The latch clicked open with familiar resistance, and my stomach tightened when I saw what remained inside. Copies again. Carefully organized, but incomplete. The original documents, the ones that carried history in the creases and margins, were gone. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding one of the copies in my hands, and felt a cold line trace its way down my spine. That was when I found it. Tucked between 2 folders was a document I did not recognize at first. A medical power of attorney, fully drafted, with my name typed neatly at the top. It outlined conditions under which someone else would be authorized to make decisions on my behalf if I were deemed unable to do so myself. The language was clinical, efficient, and unmistakably final. I had never signed it, yet everything else had been prepared, waiting only for my consent or for someone to decide I no longer needed to give it. I closed the folder slowly. In that moment, the shape of what was happening shifted. This was not about convenience or even money. This was about control at its most intimate level, about who would speak for me when my voice was questioned, about deciding, in advance, that I might one day be dismissed. Memories surfaced with a new clarity. Rebecca asking for my exact date of birth, my previous doctor's names, my medications. At the time, it had seemed considerate, responsible. Now those conversations rearranged themselves into something colder and far more deliberate. Care, I realized, can be indistinguishable from surveillance when viewed from the wrong angle. I did not cry. The absence of tears surprised me, but I welcomed it. Panic would not serve me here. I needed precision. I gathered every document I could find and placed them on the dining table, separating originals from copies, noting what was missing rather than what remained. I took out a notebook and began to write, listing dates, conversations, small moments I had previously dismissed. Each word steadied me. I did not call anyone, not my son, not Rebecca. Silence, I understood now, was not surrender. It was a strategy. Whoever had begun this process believed I would continue to drift, continue to trust. They believed I would not look closely. They were wrong. By the time evening settled into the windows, I felt something unfamiliar and grounding return to me. Control. Not the illusion of it, but the real thing, earned through attention and patience. I knew then that the truth would not reveal itself all at once. It would require time, order, and restraint. And I had begun to reclaim all three. If you're still watching and realizing this is about more than money, comment number 4 below so I know you're paying attention. From here on, every decision matters. Now let's go to chapter 5. I did not return to the bank the next day. Instead, I did something I had not done in years. I asked for help without apologizing for it. Choosing a lawyer was not an act of panic, but of recognition. Whatever had begun around me was no longer a family misunderstanding. It had crossed into a territory where intentions mattered less than documentation, and where silence could be mistaken for consent. Elaine Whitmore's office was on the 3rd floor of an older brick building near the river. The elevator moved slowly, humming with effort, and the hallway smelled faintly of paper and reheated coffee. It was the kind of place where things were handled carefully and rarely rushed. That suited me. Elaine greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that did not soften when she listened. She did not ask how I felt. She asked what had happened. I told her everything in order: the phone call, the man at the bank, the missing documents, the medical power of attorney I had never signed. I did not dramatize it, and I did not speculate. I spoke the way I used to instruct my students to write, with facts placed deliberately and emotion allowed to surface only where it belonged. Elaine listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across the page. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and nodded. She told me this was not a family conflict that could be resolved with conversation. It was a coordinated attempt to assume authority over my identity and my decisions. She explained that these cases often succeed not because the victim is incapable, but because they hesitate. They wait too long to challenge what feels uncomfortable but not yet illegal. That hesitation, she said, is where control quietly shifts. Elaine spoke next about the difference between information and experience. Documents can be keyed, signatures can be practiced, but memory, lived memory, cannot be reproduced without error. People who imitate rely on scripts. They know dates, names, and official answers. What they cannot reproduce are the unrecorded moments, the reflexive truths that surface without effort. That, she told me, was where my strength lay. She outlined a plan that did not involve confrontation. There would be no accusations, no emotional appeals. Instead, we would allow the bank's verification process to do what it was designed to do when inconsistencies appeared. Multiple confirmations, context-based questions, neutral observation. The goal was not to trap anyone, but to allow coherence, or the lack of it, to reveal itself naturally. As she spoke, something shifted inside me. I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was participating in what would come next. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Fear relies on unpredictability. Structure dissolves it. For the first time since the call, I felt steady rather than guarded. I thought briefly of my son. I did not see him as the architect of what was unfolding, but I could no longer pretend he was uninvolved. Convenience, I realized, can be a powerful accomplice. By allowing someone else to manage what required attention, he had created the conditions for misuse. It was not betrayal, but it was negligence. And negligence carries its own consequences. Before I left, Elaine confirmed that the bank would schedule a joint verification once their internal review was complete. She asked if I was prepared to be present. I told her I was not interested in humiliation or revenge. I wanted accuracy. She nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she already suspected. When I stepped back onto the street, the air felt clearer. I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned. For years, I had believed that protecting relationships meant avoiding friction. Now, I understood that protecting myself required precision, patience, and a willingness to stand still while others revealed who they were. The truth, I realized, does not need to be memorized. It only needs the space to speak. I arrived at the bank 10 minutes before the scheduled time, not out of anxiety, but out of respect for what was about to happen. There is a difference between being early to prove something and being early to steady yourself. I sat in the waiting area with my hands folded in my lap, breathing evenly, feeling neither threatened nor triumphant. I was present. That was enough. The conference room was larger than I expected, with a long table and tall windows that let in a muted, gray light. The setting was deliberate, neutral, designed to suggest process rather than judgment. Representatives from the bank and the legal department were already there, papers arranged neatly, pens aligned. No one smiled, but no one avoided my gaze either. This was not an ambush. It was an examination. Rebecca entered a few minutes later. She wore the same composed expression I had seen at the bank before, calm and controlled, as if confidence alone could anchor the room. The man beside her followed closely, his posture straight, his movements practiced. Up close, the resemblance to my son was still unsettling. But now I noticed the tension beneath it, the way his shoulders held too much awareness, as if he were constantly checking himself. The verification began with basic questions: dates, addresses, account history. He answered smoothly, confidently, like someone reciting from a well-rehearsed script. When it was my turn, the answers came without effort. I did not need to search my memory. The truth does not require retrieval. It simply exists. Then the questions shifted. They were no longer interested in what could be found in records. They asked about context, about patterns, about small, unrecorded details that only emerged through lived experience. The atmosphere in the room changed subtly, like a current redirecting itself. The man hesitated, just briefly, but enough. He answered correctly in structure, but not in substance. The words were close, but not aligned. I corrected him quietly, without emphasis, not to contradict, but to clarify. The difference mattered. I felt no satisfaction in doing so, only responsibility. Rebecca leaned forward then, offering an explanation, filling in gaps that had not been asked about. Her intention may have been to help, but her intervention did the opposite. It placed her inside the narrative instead of beside it. The room noticed. Pens paused. Eyes lifted. The coherence they were measuring began to fracture. The man's breathing changed. I saw it in the rise of his chest, the subtle tightening around his mouth. When the next question came, he glanced at Rebecca before answering. It was an instinctive movement, small but unmistakable. That was the moment everything shifted. He said then that this had not been his idea. The words came out flat, unprotected, as though they had slipped past his preparation. No one reacted immediately. There was no gasp, no raised voice, just a collective stillness, the kind that follows confirmation rather than surprise. The bank representatives exchanged brief looks. The process was paused. Documentation would be reviewed. Recording secured, further steps outlined calmly, without drama. The structure Elaine had described was unfolding exactly as it should, not through confrontation, but through exposure. I remained seated as Rebecca stood. She did not look at me. The man followed her, his confidence gone, replaced by something smaller and far more human. When they left the room, the space felt lighter, not because something had been won, but because something false had been removed. As I gathered my things, I understood that the outcome had never depended on cleverness or force. It depended on coherence, on the simple impossibility of sustaining a life that was not yours. When I walked out of the bank, the air felt sharp and clean. I did not feel relief so much as alignment. The truth had not shouted. It had waited, and when given room, it had spoken clearly. If you're still watching and felt that moment when everything quietly broke apart, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still with me. What comes next is not the end, it's the fallout. Let's move on to chapter 7. I left the bank without hurry, as if time had loosened its grip now that the most difficult part had passed. The sidewalk outside felt wider than before, the air cooler, carrying the ordinary sounds of the city. There was no rush of victory, no sudden relief. What settled over me instead was a calm heaviness, the kind that follows truth when it finally stands on its own. Consequences do not arrive with noise. They arrive with the paperwork. In the days that followed, the effects unfolded methodically. Accounts were temporarily frozen. Emails arrived outlining procedures, reviews, and next steps. Each message was precise, neutral, almost gentle in its language. There was no drama attached to any of it, just the steady movement of systems correcting a breach. I read every word. I asked questions. I responded carefully. For the first time in a long while, my name felt active again. Rebecca went silent. The calls that had once come regularly stopped altogether. No messages checking in, no reassurances. The absence spoke more clearly than any explanation could have. I did not try to fill that silence. I let it remain exactly as it was, a space that revealed its own meaning. Daniel returned from Canada 2 days later. I heard his car before I saw him, the familiar sound pulling into the driveway. When he stepped inside, he looked older than when he had left, not in years, but in weight. His shoulders sagged slightly, his movements cautious, as if he were unsure where to place himself. He stood in the living room and took in the space, noticing details he had not looked at in years. We sat at the table, the same one where he had done homework as a child. I told him what had happened from the beginning, not sparing him the sequence, but not sharpening it either. I described the call, the bank, the man who wore his face, the documents prepared without my consent. I did not raise my voice. I did not soften the facts. I simply let them exist between us. He listened without interrupting. At first, disbelief crossed his face, then confusion, then something more difficult to watch: recognition. The moment he understood that his absence had not been neutral, that his convenience had created space for misuse, his eyes dropped to the table. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He sat with it. I did not call him a traitor. I did not accuse him of intent. But I also did not rescue him from the discomfort of what he had allowed. Love, I realized, does not require shielding someone from the truth. It requires trusting them to face it. When he finally looked up, there was a quiet shame there. Not theatrical, just honest. That mattered. Our relationship shifted in that room, not toward distance, but toward something more grounded. The dynamic we had fallen into, where I yielded and he accepted, no longer fit either of us. Respect began to reassemble itself, piece by careful piece. That evening, After he left, the house felt different. Not emptier, but clearer. Questions no longer hovered unspoken. The silence held intention instead of avoidance. I understood then that facing consequences was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of repair. And repair, I knew, would require just as much attention as the deception that had preceded it. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, quieter but sharper, like a room after furniture has been moved and the echoes have nowhere to hide. Daniel came and went, careful in his movements, respectful in a way that felt newly learned. There was no tension between us, but there was a tension, and that changed everything. I no longer drifted through my days, I scheduled them. I began with the systems that had once intimidated me by their complexity. I called the bank, then the insurance provider, then the office that handled my retirement accounts. I did not ask anyone to take over. I introduced myself, spelled my name, confirmed my identity, and asked questions until the answers made sense. Each call ended the same way, with a quiet certainty returning to me. My voice carried again. Paperwork followed. Thick envelopes arrived and spread across the dining table, transforming it into a place of decisions rather than memories. I read every page. I moved slowly, not because I was confused, but because I refused to rush through what governed my life. When I did not understand a clause, I marked it and called for clarification. There was no embarrassment in asking. Embarrassment had cost me enough already. As I signed documents, the act felt different than it once had. My name no longer appeared as a formality. It anchored each page. I felt the weight of it in my hand, the responsibility and the authority bound together. This was not reclaiming control from someone else. It was reclaiming it from my own neglect. In the quiet moments between tasks, I thought about what it meant to be a mother at this stage of life. I had believed that love meant stepping aside, that support meant surrendering decision-making to younger hands. But I began to see how easily that belief blurred into erasure. Care without boundaries invites misuse, even when intentions are not cruel. The hardest decision came without anger. I asked Daniel to sit with me, and I explained that I was changing my financial and medical representatives. I told him I was removing his name, not as punishment, but as a correction. His initial surprise gave way to understanding. He did not argue. He listened. In that moment, he did something I had waited years to see. He accepted responsibility without defensiveness. After he left, I sat alone with the stillness of the house and felt something settle firmly inside me. Not relief exactly, but alignment. The sense that my life was no longer organized around avoiding discomfort. I had not pushed my son away. I had given him a clearer place, one defined by respect rather than convenience. I updated my will and reviewed my medical directives, choosing representatives based on capability and consent rather than obligation. Each decision was deliberate. Nothing was assumed. The future no longer felt like a vague threat to be managed quietly by others. It felt like a structure I could still shape. The house had not changed, but I had. The silence no longer hid anything. It held space for choice. I understood then that restoration does not mean returning to what was lost. It means building something honest in its place, with a boundary strong enough to last. If you're still watching and sensing that something irreversible has happened, comment number 8 below to stay with me. The story is heading toward its final truth, one that changes everything. Let's move to the conclusion. Weeks passed, and with them came a quiet that no longer felt fragile. The urgent emails stopped. The phone no longer rang with unfamiliar numbers. What remained was a steady rhythm shaped by decisions I had made deliberately and understood fully. I woke each morning without the faint tension that had once accompanied even the simplest tasks. Nothing dramatic had changed, and yet everything had. Rebecca disappeared from my life without ceremony. There were no explanations delivered late at night, no carefully worded apologies, no attempts to restore access under a softer name. Her absence became the conclusion. In time, I realized that closure does not always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives with distance that no longer asks to be crossed. The administrative outcomes settled into place one by one. Accounts were secured permanently. Alerts remained active. Access points were narrowed and documented. My name stood alone where it belonged, not as a symbol, but as an authority. I reviewed statements monthly and understood what I read. The language that had once felt dense now felt navigable. Familiarity replaced avoidance. My relationship with Daniel found a new shape. Without the confusion of roles, we spoke more clearly. There were fewer conversations, but each one carried weight. We discussed plans rather than permissions, concerns rather than assumptions. I did not manage his life, and he did not manage mine. Respect, I learned, thrives in defined spaces. I never felt victorious. That word implies an opponent, and what I felt instead was steadiness. I no longer measured myself against anyone else's intentions or failures. The need to prove had faded. I stood firmly within the boundaries I had drawn, and that was enough. The house reflected the change, not through renovations or rearrangements, but through use. Documents sat on my desk because I was working with them, not avoiding them. Calendars were updated because I planned my time, not because I was filling it. Even silence felt purposeful, no longer hiding what I was unwilling to confront. Age remained a fact, but it lost its power as an excuse. I did not deny my limitations, but I refused to let them define my relevance. Experience, when claimed, carries its own authority. I had simply neglected to claim it for too long. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. I did not search for reassurance there. I recognized myself without effort. There was no need to rehearse who I was or what I deserved. The space I occupied was unmistakably mine. Safety, I understood, is not something granted by proximity or care alone. It is created through visibility and consent. By reclaiming my place in my own life, I had secured something far more durable than comfort. The story was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what could no longer be taken again. The evening was quiet in a way that felt earned. I sat alone at the small table by the window, the lamp casting a soft circle of light that did not strain my eyes. There was nothing left to wait for. No phone calls expected, no documents pending. The stillness around me was no longer fragile. It held. I did not think back through the events one by one. I thought instead about the woman I had been before all of this began, the woman who confused peace with compliance and care with surrender. I had believed that being loved meant becoming smaller, easier, less demanding of space. That belief had not been forced on me. I had accepted it willingly, and that was the hardest truth to face. What I learned was not about fraud or paperwork, though those were the visible battles. What I learned was about attention, about how often I ignored the quiet signals that told me something was wrong simply because listening would have required action. Intuition does not arrive loudly. It gathers. It waits. It asks to be acknowledged before it demands to be obeyed. I understand now that no one takes your place all at once. It happens in increments. A signature rushed, a question dismissed, a decision deferred for convenience. None of it feels dangerous in isolation. Together, they form an absence. An absence, once established, is easy for others to occupy. Age did not make me vulnerable. Silence did. The moment I chose to re-enter my own life with attention and clarity, the ground beneath me stabilized. Strength did not come from confrontation. It came from presence, from staying with discomfort long enough for it to reveal what it was protecting. If you are reading this and recognize yourself in the spaces between my words, I want you to know something without qualification. You are not overreacting. You are not imagining patterns that are not there. When something consistently asks you to step aside, it is worth asking why. There are things I will not give away again. Not my name, not my voice, not the authority that comes from living a life and understanding it from the inside. I do not need to guard these things with force. I guard them by remaining visible. This is not a story about reclaiming what was lost. It is about refusing to disappear ever again. What remains after everything is settled is not victory, but clarity. The story does not end with punishment or triumph, but with presence. It reminds us that a life is not taken in a single moment, but slowly, through silence, convenience, and the habit of stepping aside. And it shows that reclaiming oneself does not require force. It requires attention. It requires the courage to pause, to look closely, and to choose not to disappear. Age does not erase worth. Experience does not expire. The quiet strength of knowing who you are and refusing to surrender that knowledge is enough to change the course of any story. When boundaries are drawn with honesty, dignity follows naturally. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more stories that speak to truth, awareness, and the power of staying present.